Namaste and welcome to a premiere of the Bharat Varta Weekly with Abhishek Paul, Nirav Kanodra and myself. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll run you through the news and events of the week and get some perspectives from our guests. So hi Abhishek, hi Nirav, how are you guys doing?
Hi Roshan, hi Nirav.
Hi,
Doing good.
all good, all good.
Okay, so plenty has been happening in the world, clearly, right? Especially in Afghanistan, right? Taliban have taken control of Afghanistan. There's also the fact that, 450 Indians are stranded there. And aside from that, there's a new needleless vaccine that has been approved. And then we're seeing a clampdown on tech in China, right? And of course, we'll round things off with something positive. The Indian cricket teams win against England at the Lords, right? So plenty to discuss. But as usual, let's start with a couple of the episodes we put out last week. I thought both of them were amazing, right? Very different. And but again, a lot of good insights and anecdotes and things to that effect. So Nirav, what did you think about the Maratha century?
Actually, all the episodes, so not just this one, but even previous episodes with Dr. Uday Kulkarni, they've been very enlightening for me because for everyone, Indian history kind of moves on from the Mughals to the British rule. And you've got all of 18th century where Marathas were dominating over India. They were controlling all from from Lahore, from Attock to Cuttack, so on the eastern seafront, and all the way in South India to Mysore and even Tanjore. So I think this is brought out quite well compared to his previous books. Here, this is one book which encompasses the whole Maratha rule from the time of Chhatrapati Shivaji till the last part in 1818. And the Battle of Panipat, where a lot of people feel that, the Maratha rule ended. It doesn't actually end there, though the British have the upper hand. So I think it's quite an interesting book. I've just purchased it on my Kindle after listening to the episode, and I plan to read it soon. So definitely, I think it's well worth listening to. And if you like the episode, then you should buy the book as well. This is just a 300-page book, so that's a selling point compared to previous books which are more detailed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I will be buying the book and I look forward to reading the book as well. A lot of Dr. Kulkarni's books are very dense and very well researched, right? So this is going to be a light, casual read. So I'm really looking forward to it. Abhishek, what do you think about the episode with Sri Vijay Gokhale?
So there was a really great episode with Vijay Gokhale, who's not only the former ambassador to China, but also the previous foreign secretary of India. Once Mr. Jaishankar became the foreign minister, Mr. Gokhale took over as the foreign secretary. I think in this, episode, Amit Paranjpe and Mr. Gokhale talked about both of his books. The first one being on Tiananmen Square, and the second one called The Long Game, right, in which he talks about how the Chinese negotiate. I think a couple of very interesting points that I took away was the fact that he emphasized how little Indians know about China in general. And that applies to almost everyone I know, including myself, right? So because our, let's say, exposure to Western and especially US culture, news, media is so much, and also that the language is same, we kind of are pretty much well versed about that. But China, with a different language and an opaque political system, means that we hardly know anything. So as you said, hardly any college kid can tell you, name 10 Chinese cities, right? But probably can tell you 30 US cities, right? That was very interesting. I think he also talked about a very interesting aspect, which is the Chinese feeling of national humiliation, which is kind of ingrained in them, and that lets them or leads them to whatever actions that the CCP takes today in especially their foreign policy, right? So it's a very powerful driving force and one which you need to understand if you have to understand the Chinese.
Yeah, absolutely. I found it fascinating, especially the couple of tips that he had on negotiation, right? On how the Chinese negotiate, including, setting the agenda very carefully and that being a very important part of the negotiation, and also managing perception above everything else, right? So given that, China is increasingly relevant in this world that we're living in, again, wonderful books to read. And I am told also that this is also for the casual reader. Both these episodes are based on books for casual readers. So do check them out. We have linked them in the description. All right, moving on to the first piece of news for the week. as expected, the Taliban have taken control over Kabul. Afghanistan's government has collapsed and the president has fled the country. He joined an exodus of his fellow citizens and foreigners. The Taliban released a statement to the Associated Press stating that they will look to form an, and I quote, open, inclusive Islamic government. Dozens of nations called on all parties involved to respect and facilitate the departure of foreigners and Afghans who wish to leave. So, Abhishek, we've discussed this on multiple weeklies earlier, right? But what was it like, to see the eventuality play out last week?
Yeah, so I think so there is a very famous quote from Lenin which is used these days where he said there are decades where nothing happens and then there are weeks where decades happen. And I mean, I can't think of a better example than what happened in Afghanistan, with this whole saga of the Taliban suddenly taking control of the country. I mean, I can't remember another historical event actually playing out with such suddenness since what led to the Afghanistan war in the first place, which is 9/11, right? I mean, we can go back a long time in history to sort of debate this. Probably you can do a separate episode on that. But to sort of do a quick recap, I think why did the US want to withdraw? I would say that over the years, the public opinion in US had become anti foreign wars. And so that has been a public opinion that has been building slowly in the US over the years. Donald Trump recognized that during his campaign, and he sort of brought back a Jacksonian isolationist foreign policy strand in the United States, right? So he was interested in rolling back the US adventure in Afghanistan, and to that effect, his administration worked on the Doha Agreement with Taliban. The agreement, which got finalized in 2020, basically said that the US will pull out its troops from the country. On the other hand, the Taliban has to ensure that the country's territories are not used by Al Qaeda for terrorist operations. And also, there was the term that Taliban and the Afghan government will work on peace talks, right? So this was broadly the terms of the Doha Agreement. But what happened is the Afghan government, which was sort of propped up by the US, led by Ashraf Ghani, they were not supporters of this agreement to begin with. One of the other key aspects of the agreement was release of a large number of prisoners. You can call them Taliban fighters or you could call them terrorists, right, who were in prisons, but they had to be released as part of this agreement. So what played out after that is that Taliban kept gaining ground throughout Afghanistan as the Western countries started pulling out their troops. What the Taliban very cleverly did is they avoided targeting directly the US or these Western troops, so they did not suffer casualties. All the casualties kept happening on the Afghan military come police side of it, right? And so in a very staggering pace, over the last few months, which got accelerated towards the end of July and in August, Taliban kept gaining district after district throughout the country. They captured big provincial capitals and finally Kabul on 15th August. A lot of the latter part of the capture happened without fighting, right? When the other side, the Afghan military / police basically gave up. They did not indulge in fighting. So this is what happened and why it happened. What has really been amazing or incredible to watch is how it happened, right? The pictures that have gone out from there have basically shown a sort of humiliating surrender by the United States. Now, President Biden gave a very strong speech justifying his decision. He basically said that this is what we had committed to in the Doha Agreement. And if the Afghans themselves will not fight for their country, then no one can help them. I mean, he gave a very damning and shocking sort of indictment of the Afghan forces, which has been widely criticized because fact of the matter is they have lost more than 50,000 people in the last few years fighting this war against Taliban. So it is not that, there was a lack of bravery per se in them. Or various sort of factors have been pointed out by media and experts on actually what happened. So I'll probably give you a few points for us to think about. One was this local regime that was propped up by the US, came through various disputed elections and was a totally corrupt regime. It was an regime which was out of touch with the locals. It was heavily centralized, did not share power properly with the rural Afghan areas. So that was a big issue, right? And that is something which the Taliban has cleverly used in their propaganda to point out the shortcomings of the erstwhile regime, right? Secondly, the military and the police, they were sort of they did not have probably the 300,000 big number which is talked about, but whatever numbers they have, they were sort of trained as a force multiplier to the US forces. So if the US does aerial bombings and gives aerial support to an operation, then they're able to, fight well. But with the US sort of pulling the plug off, they really struggled and then they could not really cope up with the Taliban, who are sort of hardened fighters. I mean, one of the big factors is this pulling out of air support. So I was reading somewhere that Afghans wanted Russian planes for their military, but the US insisted, obviously, to buy their hardware, and then the US, switched off the support of that hardware. So how are they supposed to function, right? Some of the other things which are being heavily criticized is why this troop withdrawal timing during the summer, where it is much easier for the Taliban to fight. And then also the order of withdrawal, like why did you withdraw so many military forces first, leaving behind so many civilians and Afghan support staff, like, or partners as they call them. So the sort of scenes we have seen are pretty horrendous, right? People trying to somehow reach the Kabul airport. Talking of airports, I think another fatal mistake was them pulling out of the Bagram airfield, right? That's where you could actually stay in control of the country using aerial power. Giving that up was also sort of very fatal to this cause. So, I mean, the pictures that we have seen are, really shocking. And there's a lot of blowback that is happening probably in the United States. Even though most people supported the withdrawal, it will be a very difficult, bitter pill for Americans to swallow it, right? Given the kind of public humiliation that they have suffered. The next flashpoint I see is what the question regarding refugee intake, right? So how much would that happen and all that? That will be a big sort of political football in the US the days to come.
Yeah, thanks for that very comprehensive summary. I think it certainly dents the US competence as such, right? On the world stage, Sridhar Vembu had tweeted that, the same kind of competence the US displayed in Afghanistan is also running the US Federal Reserve. It took 2 decades for the results to become plainly visible in Afghanistan. It's worth keeping that in mind, right? You could try to impute some kind of a 3D chess, some great strategic move from all of this, but it just comes down to, I think the simple answer comes down to like lack of competence, I think, right? So which is what you also mentioned. All right, we'll return to Afghanistan in just a bit, but in some positive news, the world's first DNA vaccine against COVID-19 has just been approved. India's drug regulator announced the approval of ZyCoV-D vaccine, a 3-dose jab that has been tested on 1,000 people belonging to the 12 to 18 age group. The vaccine uses small rings of DNA that contain genetic information to deliver the jab between 2 layers of the skin. This makes it India's first needle-free COVID-19 jab. DNA vaccines are relatively cheap, safe and stable. They can also be stored at higher temperatures between -2 to 8 degrees Celsius. So Nirav, looks like, this solves a wide variety of problems, right, that we have with existing vaccines. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, so absolutely. So like very big positive news. We were actually expecting that approval to come, or like they were doing phase 2 trials actually during the peak of the second wave, where the Delta variant was the major variant in India. So I think it has 66% efficiency. They tested on 28,000 people. So that's quite a large trial. Out of which 1,000 were in the age group 12 to 18. So the current vaccines being administered in India and Sputnik, they are only meant for adults at the moment. So this is one vaccine which can target the age group 12 to 18. That is about, you would say, about 12 to 13% of Indian population. So that's about a 15 crore population. And so once this is widely available, I think it helps to get a lot of children vaccinated. Adolescents can, once vaccinated, schools can reopen. So there's a very big positive externality there. Also, this is not injected via needle, but it's an intradermal injection. So just pierces the layer of the skin, not all the way to the tissue. So So probably people who are like hesitant due to worries about needles or being pricked, etc. I think this reduces hesitancy a bit. And finally, I think it is good that India has independently developed like another vaccine on its own with a different technology. I think this goes a long way in establishing like our R&D culture. Indian pharma companies, which are earlier known just to be manufacturing generics, once they went off patent, I think independent research, it's a big drive for it, as well as we've got a huge population. Unfortunately, the capacity for Zydus Cadila is about 1 to 2 crores. So it's 1 crore a month right now to manufacture, ramping up to 2 crore by October. So this will add more number of vaccines in the market. Probably, in my opinion, this will be mass marketed towards children. I think for adolescents between 12 to 18, the adults who already got one shot previously wouldn't be taking this one. And the only disadvantage probably is that it is a 3-shot vaccine. So again, there is a capacity constraint, but it adds something. We are on target by December to probably vaccinate all the adults and now hopefully a lot of the adolescents as well.
Around 450 Indians are stranded in Afghanistan. The government of India is coordinating with the United States and other embassies to assist in their return. Reportedly, those in Kabul aren't able to leave their residences without approval from Taliban guards to travel to the airport. Abhishek, we discussed at length on what is happening in Afghanistan. What do you see as an evacuation plan for those who are stuck there? And also, I think somewhere there was some talk about CAA and things to that effect, right? I mean, if you could also
what India has done so far is had more than 200 people evacuated. So there was the first tranche or first aircraft for about 40-50 people who were mostly the embassy staff. And after that, about 150 more in the second flight back, which included even journalists, right, and other Indians who were in Kabul and who were able to reach the airport. And now, as you said, about 450 or so. I think the numbers are not clear for any country. Even the US is struggling to figure out exactly how many of their citizens are remaining. So today, I believe there was some news circulating that certain Indians had been picked up by the Taliban folks. Basically, they were abducted as they were trying to reach the airport. But latest media reports seem to indicate that is not the case, and so far Indians have not been harmed by the Taliban folks. The Indian Air Force will continue to do its best over the next week or so to get all Indians out safely. I think that is the effort for all foreign countries who have presence there. Coming to the other aspect, I think we were discussing on another topic, but any event eventually becomes a domestic political football issue, right? This issue again has sort of got tied up to the whole CAA related discussion. So there was some initial press release where it was said that Indians will prioritize Sikh and Hindu Afghanistan folks as part of the rescue. But later it was quite categorically mentioned that India is opening up a special category of visas for which any Afghanistan citizen basically can apply for. You need to have obviously certain link to India. So you should have a family member or something like that in India to sort of apply for it. And then obviously the Indian Foreign Office will look at it. So I think India is doing its best possible in terms of, taking in as many folks from Afghanistan as is practicable, right? I think people will try to conflate refugees and citizenship and asylum and these kind of issues in these debates. So I think it's best to keep each of these categories separate. I think there's no talk of giving citizenship to anyone right now. The only thing is, number one, Indians have to be brought back, and then whoever is an Afghan citizen meets the conditions given out by the Indian government, they can be given asylum. So that is via this visa category, right? So That is the only discussion which is relevant right now.
No, and it's also worth noting that even 4 weeks up to the eventual fall of Kabul, I think IAF was carrying out some exercises and evacuating people and so on, right? So, all right, moving on. There's been an implosion of sorts with respect to the tech sector in China. China has proposed wide-ranging reforms clamping down on their tech companies. This move has wiped out more than $1.5 trillion from Chinese stocks. Wow. The move was made reportedly to, quote, maintain fair and reasonable market competition. One of the legislatures also include a data protection law that means companies will now need to comply with strict rules on collecting and handling people's information. The proposals ranged from ensuring the rights of drivers who work for online companies to oversight of the live streaming industry. Nirav, as I mentioned, seems like a bit of an implosion. This also has a ring of eventuality attached to it, right? What do you make of all of this?
Okay, so I think, see, China has been clamping down on tech companies. It started somewhere middle of last year. First one was Alipay IPO was shelved. So Alibaba's financial arm, so fintech arm. So that IPO was shelved. Then second was the car ride-hailing app Didi. They were advised not to do an IPO in the US, but they still went ahead. So after that, their app was removed from the Chinese app stores. So that was the next one. Then they have clamped down on like online or ed tech companies, online tutoring companies, saying that that affects like high cost of education is discouraging childbirth, and they want to encourage more children because of their demographic issues. And now they've come up with this data protection law, which again is hit the Chinese, so equivalent of the Chinese FANGs. So in the US you have FANGs or FANG M, and here in China you have BAT. So Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and like another company, Meituan, is added to that list. So these companies have borne the brunt of it because China is regulating on how the apps are collecting data as well as how the companies are using it. So this is also quite contradictory to China itself. Has the government itself collects data on its citizens and maintains a social credit score. So I think this is some friction. If you look beyond these things, I think what is the signal that the leadership is giving is probably they feel that in the previous 2 decades, they focused a lot on wealth creation, and now they're worried about inequality. So now they're looking at more redistribution. They believe that the tech sector has become extremely powerful and they control a lot of data. They have a lot of information about all the citizens, and they want to clamp that down. Also, you're seeing decoupling between you saw from when China joined WTO in 2001, they were getting coupled in the same phase with the West in terms of trade, in terms of economy, in terms of a lot of Chinese companies IPOing in the US, a lot of US investors buying Chinese shares. They even created an avenue via Hong Kong called H shares. So these are Chinese shares listed in Hong Kong, which is bulk of the market. So all of that, now we are seeing that they are trying to decouple more from Western investors as well as the Western business cycle. So probably the seeds were sown with the Donald Trump trade war started by Donald Trump. But now we are seeing Chinese are actually trying to move away. And this was the bad news. The other two relevant news coming out of China was they had one NBFC. So I would say the closest parallel is an NBFC like IL&FS, what happened in India. So there's a Chinese asset management company called Huarong, which was under financial trouble. And this week there was an announcement for a large capital injection into it by the government. So this is giving a signal that certain sectors of the economy who are lending more to the domestic focused economy, they are more important. Similarly, there is a Chinese property developer called Evergrande. This is the world's largest real estate company, and it is the company with the largest amount of debt outstanding. So it's also in some amount of financial trouble, but housing is a very important domestic sector. So those are the sectors that they want to promote. The CEO of Evergrande had actually come for the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party. So he was seen with President Xi Jinping at that event. You are seeing that China is moving away from tech. They're moving away from being coupled with the West. They're trying to decouple, and this has major implications. For India, I would say this is a very big opportunity that Western investors who they made a lot of money in the previous 2 decades, no doubt about it. But now they're seeing that the marginal return on investment is probably lower, and they would look to diversify away from China into India. We are already seeing that happening with a lot of investments into unicorns by SoftBank and a lot of other venture capital firms. So I think this will continue, as well as this kind of goes into the thing where you cannot be, it's a signal also to the Western world. You cannot have all your supply chain being critically sourced from China, because the rules could change very rapidly, and what was beneficial to you may not be. So I think these are the two things that you can take out of it. But I think this will continue for a long time. It's start of a trend. It's like a super tanker has turned. So they moved in line with the global economy, and now the tide has turned, and now they're moving away. And this is not going to reverse anytime soon.
Yeah, so just to add on to how Meera was described, I would say that you must went through the very interesting field of understand. You try to explain the why behind what is happening. And his studies, speculation, or whatever, are very interesting one which for all of us to think about. So what he's saying is that when we say tech companies on the channel starting up, they are primarily the social media or financial sort of fintech companies that China is looking to crack down upon. They are not cracking down upon quote unquote, let's call it hard tech, right? So what basically sort of clearly standards they are looking at is does this company or organization add to the national hard power of China? So are you doing work on a Facebook equivalent where people are just chatting with each other, or are you making an AI technology which can be used for warfare versus the West, right? So the basic idea is to incentivize your most talented people and channelize them into industries and organizations which will add to China's national power. So do you want your smartest guy to make the latest social media feature or a weapon, right? China and Xi Jinping would prefer if they made a weapon, right, rather than a new feature or a new color on a app, right? So that's a very sort of interesting speculation. I don't think there is any other country which thinks in these kind of high-level civilizational or national terms today in today's day and age. So something to really ponder upon for all of us.
Actually, I wanted to add a bit on this. American and Hungarian American investor George Soros, he has written an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and again he goes into like the thinking on like why or like what is the challenge. So what he says is Xi Jinping has actually changed the rules of the Communist Party for the term limits, and now he can be ruler for life or president for life, but that does not apply to the other members. So the premier, so equivalent of say a prime minister in other countries, Li Keqiang, so LKQ is initials, he would be ending his term in 2022 next year, whereas Xi would be continuing. So what he has done is he's trying to frame, and even though they don't have elections, trying to get the people's legitimacy by people wanting him instead of like any other party members, as well as clamping down on like big tech probably is to show that like Jack Ma or Pony Ma of Tencent, they became much larger than life figures. So those are being controlled or clamped down on, so that the biggest personality remains Xi Jinping, so that his tenor extension goes through smoothly.
Right. Yeah, I think it's it's also perception, as we talked about earlier, right? I mean, there can only be one seat of power in China, and that clearly has to rest with the CCP. There's no, and more specifically with Xi Jinping, right? And I think India stands to gain from all of this really, because if you look at July, for example, venture capital in India exceeded that of China for the first time, I think, in many months, right? In fact, I think could be the first ever, right? And I think already we were sort of starting to see this trend of venture capital money, investment money coming into India because of a sort of a non-China wave, and this has only accelerated that. So yeah, certainly an interesting thing to watch out for. All right. To end the weekly on a more positive note, let's talk about the wonderful game that we had at Lords, right? In what is being called one of the most intense matches in the 207-year history of Lords, India beat back defeat to win the match against England. The 151-run victory had many highlights, including Mohammad Siraj's bowling performance, then the unbeaten partnership of 89 runs between Jasprit Bumrah and Mohammad Shami. So, Abhishek, this was a perfect Independence Day gift for us, huh?
Yeah, so I think I'll stay with the Lenin quote theme. So I mean, we've gone through decades without winning, such matches away from home, and now this year we've had both Gabba and Lords, right? Both really, I would say, two of the greatest Indian Test wins away from home. Really amazing match. We started well. Raquel, Rahul 100, Rohit Sharma 80. We put up a good total, but by the end of the fourth day, I think England were well in control of the match. Right? We looked pretty down and out. The last day's play totally turned it around. Right? And firstly, Bumrah and Shami with the bat put up a terrific 9th wicket partnership, and then later all 4 Indian pacers managed to bowl out England within 60 overs to give a really thrilling win. The sort of aggression shown by the Indian pacers post the whole Bumrah versus Anderson sort of spat that happened is quite memorable. I would probably request or ask the viewers to check out the latest video by Ashwin, who, although he didn't play the match, he's continued. So he's like Carey, right? He keeps producing great YouTube content. So check out his latest episode on the Lord's match. I think you'll enjoy it a lot.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Abhishek. High praise, but yeah, I mean, he runs a very entertaining channel, and I mean, if you understand Tamil, especially, he has a bunch of people coming on and talking on his YouTube channel, right? Do definitely check it out. All right, that brings us to a wrap of the Bharat Varta Weekly this week. Next week, we have a premium episode coming out on Mathura. This is, of course, part of our series Ayodhya, Kashi and Mathura with Vivek Khaitan. We've published the previous episode. Do check it out. It's members only. It's available on our YouTube channel, and you should be able to access it if you're a member. This will have, again, rich insights and anecdotes and historical facts and perspectives on Mathura itself. Will be a treat for all cultural history fans for sure, right? So, all right, thank you so much for joining us this week. It was a pleasure to bring you all of this news and events and perspectives with my friends Abhishek and Nirav, and hope to see you soon.